The splintering sound of the antique oak door was a physical tearing in Eli Thorne's chest, not just the wood itself. He didn't move from his armchair, didn't even flinch when Greg's massive shoulder rammed the frame a second time, ripping the deadbolt free with a wrenching shriek of metal. This wasn't the son who used to bring him flowers from the yard. This was a thief blinded by panic and greed, accompanied by Chloe, whose polished, tight smile cut deeper than any blade. They stood silhouetted against the blinding afternoon sun of suburban Ohio, their shadows stretching long and accusatory across the Persian rug. The odor of wet varnish and fear, his own, clung heavy in the air. "We need the key, Dad," Greg barked, his voice tight and uneven, like sandpaper on glass. He took 2 menacing steps forward. Eli, 72 and frail, ran a trembling hand across the worn leather armrest, the rough texture grounding him. The impossible choice was laid bare. Surrender the small, tarnished silver key and betray the sacred trust his deceased wife Sarah had imposed, or hold fast and risk the utter destruction of the fragile piece that was all he had left. Eli's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. It was his lifelong curse, his stubborn paternalism, that forced this hand. He truly believed Greg and Chloe drowning in debt would ruin Sarah's legacy if they got their hands on it. He believed he knew best. The probate court hearing was scheduled in exactly 72 hours. He had to delay them until then, or everything would be lost. They didn't break down my door for money, I realized. They broke it down because they already ran out of options, and I put them there. Eli's lips pressed into a thin, colorless line, reflecting the gray light of the Ohio afternoon filtering through the broken door. "You shouldn't have done that, Greg. This house, the furniture, the quiet way things were, it was Sarah's sanctuary. You dishonor her memory by resorting to this." Eli didn't shout. He used the quiet, crushing tone of a father delivering final, irrevocable disappointment. Chloe stepped fully into the light, her face a mask of cold entitlement. Her designer purse swung against her hip with aggressive confidence. "Oh, stop it, Eli. Sarah's memory? You're sitting here in this big house in the United States suburbs on $500,000 that is legally Greg's half of the estate, while we face foreclosure on the second mortgage. This isn't about honor, it's about paying bills. It's about control, Chloe," Eli countered, his voice surprisingly steady despite the rapid percussion in his chest. "And responsibility. I tried to teach him that, but my methods failed, apparently. If you had the money now, Greg, you'd gamble it away trying to save that failing restaurant venture. I know you. That money is meant for protection, not rescue. Give me these final 72 hours to settle this in court, legally, the way your mother wanted." He adjusted his weight in the armchair, shifting, a subtle movement that carried the weight of absolute refusal. I saw the shift in Chloe's eyes then, from annoyance to raw, focused determination. She wasn't just broke, she was calculating. Greg's face tightened, turning a dangerous shade of crimson. He stepped over the wreckage of the doorframe, the heavy thump of his boot against the floorboards silencing the persistent, distant hum of the kitchen refrigerator. "You think you still control me, old man? We're past talking. The key, now." The dry, dusty scent of the disturbed old wood permeated the air, thick and oppressive, and Eli knew this wasn't a rehearsal anymore. 2. Approfondimento do mundo. Greg's hands balled into fists, his knuckles white against his tanned skin, a clear manifestation of the fury bubbling just beneath the surface. He wasn't violent, but panic made men unrecognizable. Eli watched his son, seeing the shadow of the confident, reckless young man whose lack of foresight had first cost him his college fund and now threatened to cost him Sarah's inheritance. This was the direct consequence of Eli's stubborn paternalism. He had always solved Greg's problems, creating a dependency, and now that Eli refused to bail him out, Greg resorted to force. Chloe's high heels clicked sharply on the hardwood floor as she circled Eli's chair, the sound a metronome counting down the dwindling time. 71 hours left. "He won't give it to us, Greg. He's doing this purely to punish us. He thinks we're children." She leaned in, her perfume a synthetic floral punch that momentarily masked the smell of ozone from the forced entry. "Where is it, Eli? In the safe? You think we didn't check the obvious places after Sarah died? We know you keep it separate. Where is the documentation for the trust?" Eli smiled, a small, sad curve of his mouth. "You check the obvious places, Chloe, because you look for simple solutions. That was always your failing, too. And Greg's. This trust is complicated. It ensures you have funds for the future, not for today's poor decisions." He carefully adjusted the silk lapel of his smoking jacket. The texture was smooth and cool against his fingertips, a small comfort in the suffocating tension. "My goal wasn't just to keep them from the money, it was to keep them from themselves. A desperate, misguided final lesson. Greg grabbed the back of the armchair, shaking the heavy wood so that Eli's head snapped back slightly. Stop talking about lessons. We need the money now, Dad. Tomorrow morning, they start the repossession process. Do you want your only son and daughter-in-law living on the street, here in the wealthiest part of the United States? The only sound was Greg's ragged breathing and the faint, nervous rattle of the china teacups still sitting untouched on the coffee table. 3. Obstaculo. 1. Desafio pratico, 25%. Eli remained silent, his gaze fixed on a faded portrait of Sarah above the mantelpiece. His stillness infuriated Greg more than any argument. Greg released the chair with a guttural sound of frustration and turned to Chloe, his movements clumsy. Find it, Chloe. If you won't give us the key, we tear this place apart. We only have 70 hours. This was the opening Eli needed. He had anticipated the search. He knew they would follow the logical path of finding a safe deposit box key or a physical document hidden in the house. His first practical challenge was misdirection, to keep them focused on the wrong kind of key. You're wasting time. Eli sighed, making sure his voice carried a hint of genuine worry. The documents aren't here, and the key, it doesn't open a box. It unlocks the legacy. He shifted slightly again, his hip protesting the movement, a smooth, barely noticeable displacement in the heavy leather of the chair. Chloe immediately focused on the phrase, unlocks the legacy. She was sharp, Eli conceded, but predictable. She marched to the mahogany bookshelf and began yanking down heavy, leather-bound volumes. The persistent thud of the books hitting the plush carpet filled the room. The scent of aged paper and dry dust exploded in the air with each volume she disturbed. Greg, meanwhile, began systematically emptying the drawers of the antique writing desk, sending correspondence and bills scattering across the floor like autumn leaves. They searched for a vault combination or a deed hidden under the floorboards, but they failed to understand that Sarah and I didn't hide things. We disguised them. Check the mantelpiece, Eli suggested, his voice sounding weak, adding a false layer of vulnerability to the manipulation. Sarah always kept her most prized possessions where she could see them. Greg immediately pivoted to the mantel, his large hands grasping the ceramic vases and framed photographs. Eli watched him with detached pity. The physical struggle for the key was only the first layer. The key itself was the second. 4. Subtramas e complexidades. The relentless, methodical destruction of the living room continued. Chloe, breathing hard, ran her hands along the back of the heavy curtains, searching for a sewn-in pocket. The thick velvet felt surprisingly cool under her touch. Greg, having abandoned the mantelpiece, moved on to the old grandfather clock in the hall, prying at the dark wood with the blunt end of a letter opener. Each creak and groan of the clock was a tiny, painful alarm for Eli. 68 hours remain. Eli maintained his position, his composure a deliberate weapon. He knew the pressure of time was their true enemy. He had to keep them searching physically, distracting them from the far more complex mechanism he had put in place. His stubborn paternalism mandated this protracted agony. They needed to earn the discovery, to understand the gravity of the stakes before the court date. It's remarkable how quickly you forget what was truly important to your mother, Eli murmured, loud enough to snag their attention, but low enough to force them to strain to hear. She valued memory over material wealth. The trust reflects that. Chloe stopped her search, her eyes narrowing. You're talking about those awful scrapbooks, aren't you? The ones with the blurry photos of our childhood in the United States? She remembered the scrapbooks, but she never understood the effort Sarah put into them. They represented time, not cash. They hold the past, Eli confirmed, and the key to your future. Try the attic. That's where the dust settled, Greg. Where the past lies dormant. Eli's suggestion wasn't a lie, but another layer of misdirection. He knew the attic search would consume precious hours and lead them only to old toys and moth-eaten clothes. The air was now thick with the smell of old cedar and the damp rot of undisturbed storage, mixing unpleasantly with Chloe's expensive perfume. The sound of Greg's heavy footfalls ascending the narrow attic stairs reverberated through the quiet Ohio house. 5. Obstaculo 2, Dilemma Morale, 50%, Irreversión. 2 hours later, sweat beaded on Greg's forehead as he stumbled back down from the attic, covered in a fine layer of dust, his breathing ragged. Chloe sat hunched on the floor amidst the wreckage, running a tear-streaked hand over a small stuffed bear. 66 hours remain. They looked defeated, the initial predatory energy draining away, leaving only exhaustion. There's nothing, Dad, Greg croaked, dropping a heavy locked cedar chest on the floor with a crash. Just junk. You're lying. You enjoy this, don't you? Watching us grovel. Eli's face remained impassive, but internally, the second obstacle presented itself, the dilemma. Should he let them continue this fruitless, destructive search for another day, increasing their suffering and humiliation? Or should he give them a true clue? The goal of his stubborn paternalism was to teach them responsibility, but he feared he was simply cultivating resentment. "The key is on me, Greg," Eli confessed, his voice barely a whisper, forcing Greg to lean closer. "But it's not the key you think. It's the knowledge needed to bypass the bank's encryption. It's in the safe deposit box, yes, but the box is locked by a memory, not a combination." Reversion 1. The key was never about opening a lock. It was about initiating the transfer. Chloe snapped her head up. "The bank? Which bank? We checked all of Sarah's accounts in this part of the United States." "The First National Bank of Dayton," Eli said, placing his hand over his chest where the faint outline of a small metallic object pressed beneath his clothes. "But the account is in my name. The trust stipulates the fund can only be accessed if I, Eli Thorne, provide the code phrase, proving my sound mind to release the money to the heir. Sarah made me the final safeguard." The air crackled with a sudden, sharp realization. The smooth texture of the old leather armchair now felt cold and unforgiving beneath Eli. They looked at the furniture, then at the broken door, then at me. They hadn't come for a physical key. They'd come for my confession. "The code phrase," Greg whispered, his eyes wide. "What is it?" 6. Consequences de reversion. The atmosphere in the room shifted from chaotic searching to surgical tension. Greg and Chloe stopped looking at Eli as an obstacle to be bypassed and started viewing him as a fragile puzzle piece that needed careful, immediate extraction. The knowledge that the physical key was irrelevant and that Eli himself was the final ticking lock gave their desperation a deadly focus. "The phrase is simple," Eli explained, trying to keep his breathing even, despite the knot of fear tightening in his stomach. "It's the answer to a question Sarah always asked me, a secret between us, tied to a specific memory. If I tell you the phrase now, Greg, you will withdraw the money and use it to solve your immediate crisis. You will forget the greater lessons. The 72 hours Macrans will have been wasted." Chloe knelt beside Eli's chair, abandoning her aggressive stance for a sickeningly sweet display of concern. She placed a hand on his knee. The warmth of her palm was immediately unsettling against his thin trousers. "Eli, please. If we lose the house, Greg will lose his focus entirely. This isn't about the restaurant anymore. It's about survival. Give us the phrase. You can trust us." I saw the lie shimmering just behind her practiced empathy. They were trying to manage me now, not threaten me. Eli leaned back, his movement triggering a small internal shift in his body, a micro-adjustment only he would notice. The rich, woody smell of the pulverized door was starting to fade, replaced by the sharper, metallic tang of anxiety. "Trust is earned, Chloe. You've just broken down my door. I have seen feasip 4 hours. Until the judge ensures this is handled legally. I will not compromise Sarah's final wishes merely because you ran out of time." Greg paced behind them, his shadow looming large and menacing over the armchair, the only sound the hollow thump of his footsteps. 7. Superação e crescimento. Greg stopped pacing abruptly, his shoulders slumped not in defeat, but calculation. He ran a hand through his damp hair. Okay. If you won't give us the phrase, give us the question. We'll work it out. If it's tied to a memory, maybe we can figure it out. We were a family, Dad. We share memories, even if you've decided to hoard them now." Eli saw a flicker of genuine desperation, a momentary break in his son's characteristic arrogance. He realized his initial stubborn refusal was failing. To maintain his control and still teach the lesson, he had to provide a breadcrumb, but a confusing one. He had to make them work. "The question is about where we were truly happiest," Eli revealed, his voice strained. He tilted his head slightly, a deliberate movement. Sarah's question was, "Where did we stop running, Eli?" The code phrase is the answer. It's a date, Greg. A specific, important date tied to that location, that moment. I watched his face, searching for a spark of recognition, hoping he'd remember a time before debt and desperation had consumed them. Chloe immediately pulled out her phone, her thumb already flying across the screen, searching old family calendars and digital archives. The persistent tap-tap-tap of the glass was the only rhythmic sound in the room. Greg stared blankly. "Stop running?" "We moved around a lot in the United States. Was it the first house? The apartment in the city?" The leather of the armchair squeaked slightly as Eli shifted, trying to signal the general direction of the answer without speaking. The lingering scent of old varnish from the freshly damaged door mixed with Chloe's tense efforts. Eli held his breath. His stubborn paternalism demanded he hold out, but the image of his son struggling stirred a deep, aching conflict. 8. Obstaculo, 3. Accresi maxima, 75%. Greg finally remembered something, his eyes widening. The cabin! Upstate New York, the little log cabin we rented for a month when I was 10. We stayed there after your father, my grandfather, died. You said then, "This is the first time in years I haven't felt like I needed to catch up." That was the moment, wasn't it? Eli nodded, a slow, solemn tilt of his head. Yes, the cabin. But the date, Greg. The date is the code. You have 58 hours left. Chloe, furious at the realization that the answer was a sentimental date Greg knew and she didn't, slammed her phone down. Figure it out then. What was the date you arrived? Was it the day Grandpa died? The day we left? Greg paced again, running his hands over the smooth, cold surface of the marble fireplace. I don't remember the exact date. We didn't keep a meticulous record like that. He looked at Eli, his expression hardening back into resentment. You know the date, Dad. Just tell me. Eli hesitated, and that fraction of a second was all Greg needed. Driven by the suffocating weight of debt and Eli's stubborn paternalism, Greg snapped. He lunged, not for the armchair, but for Eli's frail body, grabbing the small of his back and shoving him forward. Eli hit the wooden floor hard, the shock running through his spine, stealing the breath from his lungs. The impact caused the small, tarnished silver key hidden on his person to tear through the thin fabric of his shirt pocket. It clattered loudly on the floor. The sound of the key hitting the wood was the sound of my total self-inflicted defeat. I pushed him too far. You moved, Dad, Greg snarled, hovering over him, his face distorted with panic and rage. You shifted, and I knew you were hiding something physically. You lied about the documents not being here. Chloe immediately snatched up the key. The air reeked of stale sweat and the metallic tang of blood welling up from a scrape on Eli's hand. Greg's failure to trust Eli, born from Eli's failure to trust Greg, had led to this violent breach. 9. A noite escura da alma. Eli lay winded on the cold, hard floor, ignoring the throbbing pain in his hip. He stared up at the high ceiling of the Ohio house, his vision blurring. He hadn't lied entirely about the documentation. The key was necessary, but not for the bank vault. Chloe turned the silver key over in her hand, the metal reflecting the harsh overhead light. It's a storage locker key, Chloe announced, a cruel triumph in her voice. Check the address stamped on the back, Greg. Somewhere local in this expensive United States county. Greg grabbed the key and examined the tiny engraving. Public Storage, Unit 412. It's across town. That's why he wasn't worried about the court order. He hid the physical trust papers off-site. He looked down at Eli, his expression a mixture of guilt and accusation. You didn't trust us at all, did you, Dad? You were going to let us lose everything. Eli pushed himself up slowly, leaning heavily on the overturned armchair. He spat a bit of dust from his mouth. I needed you to understand the risk, Greg. I needed you to wait 57 hours and handle this responsibly. But you chose violence and theft. He felt the crushing weight of his failure. His stubborn paternalism hadn't protected the legacy. It had destroyed his relationship with his son. He realized now that Sarah hadn't made him the safeguard merely to control the money. She made him the safeguard to force a final, honest conversation with Greg, something Eli had desperately tried to avoid through rigid control. My fear of his failure eclipsed my love for him, and now lying on the floor, I finally understood the true cost of my obsession with being right. The rough texture of the rug pressed against Eli's cheek. Chloe and Greg didn't offer help. They were already halfway to the broken door. The loud, hurried sound of their footsteps disappearing down the hall was the sound of abandonment. Eli was alone, knowing they would soon have the papers, and he had failed his wife's trust by hiding the physical truth. 10. Climax. Eli dragged himself back into the armchair, sinking into the familiar leather, now tainted by the memory of violence. He pulled out his phone, his fingers trembling, and dialed the number of the probate lawyer. He had to assume they had the documents now, and he needed a final defense. The race was now purely against the clock. 56 hours. Until the hearing. Meanwhile, Greg and Chloe drove recklessly across town, the smell of burnt rubber filling the car whenever Greg accelerated too hard. They arrived at Public Storage. the air thick with the industrial scent of concrete and chain-link fencing. Unit 412 was in the back corner, shadowed and silent. Chloe fumbled with the silver key, finally clicking the padlock open. Greg yanked the roll-up door, the mechanism protesting with a loud, grinding metallic screech that echoed across the empty lot. Inside the unit sat a single, plain brown cardboard box. "We did it," Chloe gasped, relief flooding her face. Greg tore open the box, his hands rough and fast. Inside, meticulously organized, were thick stacks of financial documents, labeled Sarah Thorne Trust, along with a letter from Eli, sealed and addressed to Greg. They expected the immediate cash transfer documents, the key to their salvation. But what they found was worse than a refusal. Greg opened the letter first. His eyes scanned the familiar, shaky handwriting of his father. The letter didn't contain the password. It contained the date they had been searching for. July 14th, 1999. The day they left the cabin. The code phrase. But the letter continued. Eli's final sentence, underlined twice, sealed the climax. "Now that you have the trust documents, you will see that accessing the funds is no longer restricted by my memory, but by my life. You have 55 hours to prevent my legal execution." Greg's face turned gray. He looked back at the financial stacks, the white paper a stark contrast to the shadowy interior of the unit. He noticed the very last document on the pile, which was not part of the trust at all. It was an insurance document, specifically a living will, prepared by Eli Thorne in the United States, and signed 3 days earlier. 11. Reversion du irresolution. Greg's hands shook as he read the first line of the living will. It wasn't a suicide note. It was a devastating legal maneuver. Reversion. The trust funds were set up to be immediately accessible to Greg if, and only if, Eli Thorne was declared legally incapacitated or deceased. The documents revealed that Eli, facing a terminal diagnosis discovered just months after Sarah's death, had structured the trust with a final, paternalistic condition. If Eli died, Greg received the money immediately, bypassing the court's slow process. If Eli lived, the court maintained control for another year to ensure sound management, forcing Greg to prove his responsibility. Eli's final line in the letter to Greg read, "The silver key you hold is not for the storage unit, Greg. It is my DNR key, my do not resuscitate marker. I had a severe incident this morning. The forced entry and physical assault triggered it. I signed the DNR and had my doctor certify it this morning. If I am not at the probate court hearing in 54 hours, or if I die before then, you get the money immediately, no questions asked. The question is, do you want the money or do you want your father?" Chloe stared at the document, the truth sinking in with chilling clarity. "He gave us the option, Greg. He's forcing your hand. If we do nothing, he dies in the next day or two, naturally, and we get everything." The trust wasn't a punishment for their greed. It was Eli's final, desperate attempt to force Greg to choose responsibility over immediate self-interest. The documents felt heavy and cold in Greg's hands, their crisp, sterile texture a contrast to the emotional weight they carried. He looked at the date, July 14th, 1999, the code phrase for the bank, now useless. Eli had confessed the memory, yet the obstacle was not a memory, but a life. The faint, echoing sound of distant traffic outside the storage unit felt horribly distant from their dilemma. Greg didn't hesitate this time. He shoved the trust documents back into the box. "We're leaving the money, Chloe. We're going back." 12. Conclusion cum custo. Greg drove faster on the return trip, but now with a desperate purpose fueled by love, not greed. They burst through the already shattered front door of the house in suburban Ohio. The room was dark, illuminated only by the fading afternoon light. Eli was still in the armchair, his breathing shallow, his skin pale and clammy. The smell of old house dust and recent distress hung in the air. "Dad! I'm calling 911, Greg shouted, fumbling for his phone. Eli raised a weak hand, stopping him. His voice was a dry, rasping sound, barely audible above the frantic beating of Greg's heart. "No. The DNR. You read the documents. If you call, the money is locked up by the court because I lived. You have to choose, Greg. Now. The money or the man." Greg collapsed to his knees beside the armchair. He looked at the wreckage of the door, the overturned desk, the silver key in his pocket, the marker of his father's impending death. He had finally seen beyond the money, but only because Eli forced him to look into the abyss. "I choose you, Dad. I don't care about the money. Just stay with me." He gently placed his hand over Eli's, the rough texture of his skin a contrast to Eli's papery fragility. He called 911, ignoring Chloe's sharp, silent glare from the doorway. Custo da Vittoria. Eli survived. He spent 3 weeks in the hospital recovering from the cardiac incident triggered by the assault, but he eventually returned home. Greg attended the probate court hearing, where the judge commended his difficult choice, confirming the trust would remain under court supervision for 1 year. Greg had saved his father's life, and in doing so, had finally demonstrated the maturity Eli had demanded, but the victory was bittersweet. Chloe left Greg 2 days after the court hearing, taking the last of their savings. Eli, sitting alone in his repaired armchair in the quiet Ohio house, now carried a permanent visible scar on his wrist where the DNR bracelet had been attached, a constant reminder of the extremity of his own stubborn paternalism and the loss of his son's wife. He had won the battle over the money and saved his life, but lost the family peace forever. We both paid the price for my need to control the outcome, and the silence in the house was louder than any argument we ever had.